Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio this evening. It is Tuesday evening, 7:30. We've got an interview live momentarily with Julia Waters, the sister of Ruth Perry. That's going to be coming up in just a minute. Just before we kick off with that interview, it would be a good time for me to mention our sponsors and supporters on the show this evening, which is Teach Well Toolkit. If you haven't heard of Teach Well Toolkit, you can find out more on the web address that's on screen, teachwelltoolkit.com. They are a multi-award winning company who equip school communities to build a culture of staff and pupil mental health. They are a DFE approved provider of the Senior Mental Health Lead Program and have trained over 100 schools to date. They are led by Steve Waters and Sunita Bagri, and Steve and Sunita are both qualified MHFA instructors and mindfulness teachers. If you're interested in the training that they provide to schools, then again, you can visit them at teachwelltoolkit.com. The web address is on screen. The training is free. It's DFE funded, so you can get in touch with them and get involved. So highly recommend checking that out. I'm now going to just bring our guest onto the screen. Good evening, Julia. How are you this evening?
Hello, Tom. I'm well, thank you.
Excellent. Now, Julia, I'm sure to many of you needs no introduction. But Julia, perhaps you could, just for our watchers out there, watchers and listeners, perhaps you could introduce yourself just briefly so people know who you are.
Well, I suspect I'm invited onto this show and am known by your listeners, watchers, for all the wrong reasons, really. So my sister was Ruth Perry, the head teacher who took her own life last January after an Ofsted inspection. But before that cataclysm hit me and my family, I still am an academic myself. I work in higher education, modern languages at the University of Reading. So I know education, but from a different angle, really.
Yeah. And, it goes without saying that everyone at Teachers Talk Radio and everyone out there actually in the teaching profession are very sorry for your loss. And I think that one thing, just from a personal point of view, that I'd like to say is thank you for the dignity and calmness and approach that you've had to everything that's happened in the last 2 years, and that's sort of on behalf of everybody, all our listeners and everybody engaging with it. The first thing that I thought would be relevant for us to do before we get into this conversation is just to highlight, if you like, what has happened for people who do not actually know this, because we may have watchers and listeners who are outside of the UK who do not really follow fully what exactly has gone on. So I thought what would be good to begin with is for me to read the coroner's summary of this particular case. Now, this was the first Ofsted inspection that Caversham Primary School, who Ruth Perry was the head teacher of, had for 13 years. Now, there had previously been a policy which meant that schools who've been rated outstanding were not inspected on the usual timelines. So in other words, some schools who were rated outstanding might not be inspected for in excess of 10 years. Now, there was a policy change in 2021, and Caversham Primary was then due for one of these inspections, one of these post-outstanding grade inspections, if you want to call it that. And this was the reason for the inspection in November 2022. And Caversham underwent that inspection on the 15th and the 16th of November 2022 with Ruth as head teacher. And it was during that inspection and after that inspection that Ruth's mental health deteriorated significantly. She displayed suicidal ideation and planning a few days after the inspection. She sought mental health support, but felt unable to discuss the likely outcome of the inspection in any detail. And Ruth had no relevant past mental health history. The records and evidence that were set out in this report, by the way, I'll put that on screen just so people can see it. And it's a document that is available. It is open source. It's out there. But the records and evidence set out during that hearing clearly stated that what the cause of the mental health deterioration was. It was the Ofsted inspection. And she took her own life on the 8th of January 2023. Now, what I wanted to start with, Julia, before we explore Ofsted as an organisation and the future of Ofsted and all the things around that, and I know you'll have been asked this many, many times before, but I wanted to ask you about the key events during this period of time. So the first thing I want to ask you is, before all of this happened, before you even knew that your sister's school was going to be inspected, what were your views of Ofsted then?
I didn't have any particularly strong views one way or another, frankly. I mean, I've got 2 school-age children myself, so I was clearly aware of Ofsted. I think I can genuinely say I had, previous to the Caversham Primary report, never read an Ofsted report. I was probably aware when I applied for my children's primary schools and secondary schools of what the grade was, I think. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure of that. What mattered to me actually was going into the school. In fact, I remember Ruth saying to me, when going into a primary school, what should I look out for? She said, you'll just get a sense of whether, it's like buying a house. You go in and you know if it's right for you and right for your children. So she said things like, who shows you around? What do you see? Are the school premises well maintained? Is there plenty of evidence of children's artwork on the walls? Are the notices up to date? Those kind of things. So you just get a sense that this is the kind of place where your children would be happy. And that was the basis on which I made the decisions. My children went perfectly happily to the local state school, primary and secondary. And it was very much based on my own visit and talking to parents whose children went there and getting a sense from them of the school's strengths and the areas of, of improvement, if you like. But I genuinely don't think that the Ofsted reports had any major influence on me.
It's interesting. So
I was really aware of Ofsted, and I was aware through my sister, through many of my friends who are teachers, of the pressures that Ofsted creates. But as a parent, Ofsted wasn't something I, worried myself about unduly.
Did you know in the period leading up to the inspection at Caversham, did Ruth ever sort of mention to you, I'm stressed / worried about when this inspection is going to happen? Or does she not mention that at all?
No, she was very relaxed and ready and prepared. I think, there was some coverage of it a while ago, but actually in 2019, Ruth, in preparation for Ofsted coming in, had volunteered to be part of a pilot test case for the new inspection framework. They were successful. The team came in, they got glowing feedback. The team was overseen by Amanda Spielman herself, who came into Caversham Primary School. It obviously wasn't a graded inspection, but the feedback they received was very positive and sort of confirmed the school's self-evaluation of their strengths and, continuing good, outstanding features as far as Ruth and her staff were concerned.
When did you first, because we mentioned the inspection took place in the November of 2022. So when was it that you first became aware that there was a problem? I
had been texting Ruth about, so we were meant to be we were arranging something for that weekend. And I'd been sort of texting her and she'd been sort of pinging back, we were making arrangements. And then she stopped doing so. I didn't hear from her. So the 14th, I remember I sort of sent a couple of messages and didn't get replies, which was unusual, but I didn't think anything of it. The 15th, so the Tuesday, I followed up. I said, are you still coming to this event at the weekend? And she texted me back saying, I'm in the middle of a dreadful Ofsted inspection. It's been the worst day of my life. I think we're going to fail. And my reaction was just, don't be daft. You're overreacting. Everybody knows what a fantastic school Caversham Primary is. Everybody knows what a great head teacher you are. Don't worry, you'll be fine. And then again, I didn't hear from her. And I saw her. She then came to see me on the Thursday. So the inspection was the Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah.
And she came to see me on the Thursday. And she was almost unrecognizable. The sort of the strain, you could just see it. She was really deeply upset. She was pale, she was shaking, I've never seen her like it before. So it was, she was her normal, happy, confident, overworked like all head teachers self, up to, Monday morning, boom, during the day on Tuesday, it was almost as soon as the inspection started, I understood that it started to go wrong and impacted her.
Did you, when you saw her on that Thursday, I think you said it was, like after the Tuesday, Wednesday, did you, like, what was your, I know it's probably a silly question, but what was that where you sort of really engaged with it because of that? Were you like, right, this is sort of serious now after that? You saw her and that?
I could see, well, she told me, one of the first things she did, she came in and she said, I'm broken. She said, they broke me. And she came up to me and leant against me. And I gave her a hug and she cried. And I suppose, if I'm honest, I mean, I could see it had an immediate and dreadful effect on her, and she never really recovered from that. But I think you have to be a head teacher yourself really to understand what it feels like, what an attack that is on your whole sense of identity. How much Ruth's whole self-worth was tied up with her job and with that school and her role in the community. And it was only really, I think, it was only really after Ruth's death when I spoke to other head teachers and, suddenly the floodgates open with all these other head teachers contacting me. The number of people who contact me and said, I understand how Ruth felt. It was sort of then, I could see the terrible impact it had on her. I spoke to her, at length in those awful 54 days in detail about what happened during the inspection and how she was feeling and so on. So, I was in no doubt about what a terrible, terrible toll that inspection and its likely consequences and everything had on Ruth. But I think it was really afterwards hearing other head teachers, how shocking, how haunting it was to hear other people saying, I understand. That I already knew that if an Ofsted inspection could do that to my sister, who was a tough cookie, who was an experienced head teacher, who was very well respected, who ran a school with just amazing results and attendance, it sort of scored highly on everything. If an Ofsted inspection could do that to her, I already knew that there has to be something wrong with a system that can do that to someone. But then hearing all these other head teachers contact me saying, I know how she felt because I've been there, and lots saying that, or I can only too well imagine how she must have felt, the impact of that on her as a head teacher.
You've mentioned, I've seen you mention actually a few times that she was a tough cookie. I was wondering sort of like what you mean by that. Like, can you, like, what I'm interested in is sort of just knowing how she would react to situations as a person. Because
that tough cookie, yeah, I've sort of said it a couple of times, but it was a description that one of Ruth's colleagues used to describe her in the inquest, in her testimony in the inquest. You know, there have been implications, shall we say, that, oh, there must have been, you know, something, Ruth must have had mental health issues before, or, you know, Amanda Spielman didn't have wide enough shoulders or whatever, that, you know, you've got to be a certain kind of leader to you know, take it. She was, she'd been in education for 32 years. She'd been head of Caversham Primary for 12. She'd been deputy head previously. She'd been a maths advisor for the local authority. She'd been deputy in another really quite tough school beforehand. She'd worked in inner city schools in London. You know, she knew education inside out. She'd worked in some really challenging schools. And I'm sure the head teachers, many listening to you, will understand, you know, she did some difficult parents to deal with on occasions. She did some tricky staffing issues to deal with, as, you know, anyone in a leadership position will have. And she was always fair. She followed procedure, whatever, but she could be, you know, she knew her mind. She would deal with those things and generally didn't let them faze her. They were, you know, she recognized she needed to do these things, and she did.
But it's interesting you say that, because there is sometimes that perception, which you've touched on, of if you haven't come well out of Ofsted, or if you don't respond well to it, you know, some have said things like, yeah, you know, like you just, I think you used the phrase like having broader shoulders, or, you know, not being able to, you know, deal with the fire sort of thing, you know what I mean, and not being strong enough essentially to deal with. I mean, I've seen intimations of that knock around at various points. I mean, what would you say to those people? Because there are people who still say that.
I would say, you know, what kind of world are we living in which it's acceptable to do that to people? You know, why would a school inspection system, you know, we talk about education, we talk about people who work with children. Why do we need a system that's so punitive, that's based on really toxic emotions like shame and humiliation, that pits one school against another, head teachers against teachers? You know, why is that deemed to be an appropriate way to drive up school standards? You know, why aren't we asking questions about our society? Frankly, if we're getting to the point where you've got to be absolutely Teflon coated in order to have an inspection of a school, of a primary school. I mean, I also, something else that I have learned, I said, as well as, you know, I've spoken to other head teachers and understand vicariously now through them, and that what they have said, quite how damaging that inspection was to Ruth. I have also, since Ruth's suicide, too late, learnt a lot about suicide prevention and about things that can cause people to consider taking their own lives. I wish I'd known it before. But again, contrary to many perceptions, the majority of suicides are not actually mental health related. You know, that, yes, of course there are suicides, tragically, sadly, with people who have mental health, long-standing mental health conditions that aren't supported well enough, whatever. But the majority of suicides are actually crisis-driven. So a moment of sudden crisis, someone, suddenly loses their job, a divorce, a bereavement, some terrible, shocking crisis, followed by a lack of appropriate support, a feeling of entrapment, of finding, no alternative way out being offered, shame, humiliation, the fear of public humiliation, what are people going to say, and often a sense of injustice as well, that there's, that this thing that's happened is unfair and there's nothing that the person can do about it. That, applies to suicides across the board. And I look at it and I think all of those features played on Ruth's mind. All of those features actually are baked into the Ofsted inspection system. They are dangerous. They're dangerous, potentially life-threatening stressors that are the way that this inspection system is constructed and the consequences of this the inspection system. So it's not a matter of, you've got to be tougher to be a head teacher. If that can happen to Ruth, it can happen to anyone. If anyone is put under a sufficient level of intolerable pressure in those kind of circumstances, can see no way out, is not given the right support, not given sort of alternatives, has got no opportunity to fight back and complain about this, for instance, that it's a real danger. And frankly, that's what the coroner concluded. There's a risk of future deaths unless the system is amended.
So let's circle back to the sort of timeline, because we've talked about the lead up to the inspection. We've talked a little bit about during the inspection itself. But since obviously all of this has happened, you will have found out a lot more about what happened during the 2-day inspection. So a bit more, right? So I was wondering if you can tell us, because there'll be people like me who weren't in the coroner's hearing. There'll be a lot of people out there who do not know the details of what happened in that 2-day inspection. We've seen sound bites. We've seen it was bad, this happened, that happened. But can you tell our viewers here at Teachers Talk Radio what happened during those 2 days? What were the things that happened?
I have to be quite careful here. Lots of people have said, listening, sitting through the inquest, reading, they were like over 2,000 pages of disclosure evidence. I read every word, reading that, people have said, was it a shock? Was it upsetting? I go, well, of course, there are elements of it that were really upsetting to sort of read, what my sister went through stage by stage. But actually, I knew most of that already. Ruth had told me.
Yeah.
Most, not all of it. There was some of the stuff that came out that Ruth wasn't aware of, that was in the evidence base, for instance. But I have to be careful in that the inquest, the coroner rightly sort of set the scope of the inquest to look at the impact of the inspection and the consequences on Ruth and what could be done differently to prevent future deaths. She was very careful not to sort of revisit whether the judgment was fair or not, though it became very obvious during the process of the inspection that Ruth's colleagues, the local authority, the governors, the local MP all thought it was wrong, unfair. But there were some of the details. What I can say is, hand on heart, as the mother of children who got in school, if my children had been at Caversham Primary, none of the things that lead inspector identified as safeguarding failings would have worried me in the least. I would have had no qualms at all about continuing to send my child into school. There were some disagreements on sort of, on how behaviour was interpreted. There were some, not DBS checks, there was nothing like that. There were a couple of recruitment checks, sort of secondary recruitment checks that were completed during day one of the inspection, but are still there on the report as, recruitment checks weren't done. Well, they were. By midday of the first day of the inspection, the 2 bits of missing paperwork had been put in place. There were disagreements, shall we say, over the way that potential safeguarding concerns were recorded. I had, as it happens, a follow-up meeting with someone from Ofsted before the inquest, before I'd seen the evidence base. And I remember this person, senior person at Ofsted, saying then, well, the information was known, it just wasn't all in one place. So anyway, what came out in the inquest, what was made public in the inquest, was that during a meeting between the lead inspector and the chair of governors on day 2, the lead inspector said to the chair of governors that Caversham Primary had a robust culture of safeguarding, that all children felt safe and knew who to turn to if they had worries.
Okay.
But they still gave an inadequate judgment on the basis of safeguarding concerns that were, as the inspectors acknowledged, as they had said themselves, could easily be put right before the report was published.
Yeah, so it said in the coroner's report up to 30 days. I think the biggest one to put
well,
right
actually,
was
there was some disagreement in the and this did come out in the inquest, between the sort of notes that were made in during the inspection, whether someone had said these things could be put right by the end of the week or before the report's published. So the longest time, and the lead inspector agreed to this, that these safeguarding record keeping concerns would take to put right would be, according to Ofsted's timelines, 30 working days. But according to the inspection framework, that's still, with the limiting judgment and so on, that still warranted an inadequate judgment with the threat of academisation and loss of jobs, the same way as, a school that had really serious concerns across the board.
I mean, it sounds to me, just from what you've said there, that there was scope for Ofsted to make some reasonable adjustments and changes. Perhaps they would argue, I'm sure, that this is our sticking to what is written in our handbook type of thing.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like, if they'd have said, I don't know, it sounds like there may have been some scope there for.
Well, I think the other thing, and this was probably the most upsetting thing, and to hear it from the inspectors themselves, they came to the conclusion that, and I think in the report it said that leaders do not have the necessary understanding of safeguarding or something to keep children safe. It became very obvious that was largely based on the fact that Ruth was unable to answer the inspector's questions properly. So her colleagues gave very moving testimony in the inquest to how traumatized Ruth was. I mean, when she came out of the very first meeting with the lead inspector, there'd been like a 45-minute meeting. It was just her and the lead inspector. She came out, she was shaking, she was red-faced, she was barely coherent. She could hardly string a sentence together. She came out and said, I need to leave now. I need to leave the school. And they could, had to calm her down. And she was clearly incredibly distressed. And she then went on and had, I think the inquest said, another 8 one-to-one meetings with the same lead inspector. Only during two of those meetings, one of Ruth's colleagues was called in at some point, and they said Ruth was in tears. She wasn't able to answer. The meeting that they saw, the part of it that they saw was the coroner said rude and intimidating. They weren't given the opportunity to put across their point of view. The lead inspector held his hand up and stopped them mid-sentence, disagreed with what they said categorically. So clearly the behaviour of the lead inspector was a real concern. But the fact then that Ruth had felt unable, and she told me this at the time, she said she felt like she was bludgeoned. She could hardly get a breath between his sort of questioning. When she tried to answer his questions, he'd go, "Oh, that's enough of that. Come on, let's move on to the next one." If she tried to defend her point of view, he'd accused her of being in denial, saying things like, "I beg to differ." There was this sort of disagreement. So I think essentially, I remember Ruth describing to me afterwards how she'd felt. And he, at one point he said, "So where are your notes of this meeting?" And she went, "In my book." And she sat there and she sort of imitated having her book of notes like this. And she, this sort of dejected. And yeah. I think she sort of gave up, which, given, as I said, Ruth's, how tough she could be, she just felt unable to put her point of view across. When she tried, the lead inspector wouldn't listen to it. And sadly, as became very obvious in the inquest, he took this inability to be able to answer his questions as evidence that she didn't know her safeguarding. And just a little aside there, I found this out after Ruth's death. She hadn't told me. I knew that Ruth had been on the Berkshire West Children's Safeguarding Board for like over 10 years as the local primary school rep. And she had just been appointed chair of the West Berks Children's Safeguarding Board on the basis of her safeguarding understanding by her peers. But according to the lead inspector, she didn't know her safeguarding, and therefore was judged inadequate. And I think that must have preyed on her mind as well, thinking, "Oh, I've just been, appointed to this post, and according to Ofsted, we're failing on safeguarding."
Yeah. Obviously, we'll come on to your sort of campaign in a minute that you initiated after Ruth's death. But when Ruth passed, after that happened, did the reaction of the profession sort of surprise you or make you think in any way about the situation? Or what's your perception of the reaction from the profession at that time? For example, we had Flora Cooper, who's been involved with Teachers Talk Radio in the past, sort of consider refusing to let inspectors in. We had other stories where there were petitions, there were huge petitions, there were huge social media campaigns, right, in the immediate aftermath of that. Did that surprise you, or were you sort of expecting that?
Do you know it? I mean, it's hard to say. I was, you can imagine, still in a state of really profound shock. So it's hard to know.
Yeah.
What I expected and what was normal. I mean, nothing has been normal in the last 16 months. In some ways, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised because, even when I remember, after the inspection, but when Ruth was still alive, we obviously talked about the inspection a lot. We talked about Ofsted a lot. And
was she still in work during that period?
Yeah. Yeah, she kept going into work. She kept going in. And yeah, but I remember her at one point saying she had Googled, is saying, don't do this at home. Don't do this at home. She had Googled, after what do head teachers do after a inadequate Ofsted judgment? Don't do it. Because what you find is not lots of nice practical tips of alternatives. So-and-so went off and opened a B&B in Dorset and this person became a supply teacher and is now really happy or whatever. What she found were these accounts of people killing themselves, having nervous breakdowns, being forced to resign and sort of marched off the premises in shame and whatever. I mean, it was shocking. And you go back, and I was with her once, and you go back, and we found, you easily find it goes back. It goes back 10 more, that we found other suicides linked to Ofsted, and so I could already see the impact that inspection had on Ruth, and what struck me is the sort of like profound unfairness of the way it was conducted, of the things that were allegedly found, of the sort of lack of options that Ruth was then offered. What's she meant to do? But then, seeing, my God, this has been going on for a long time. Ruth isn't the first, far from the first. Why has no one spoken out about it before? Why has no one done anything? So I do, I do remember saying to Ruth, look, there's a real issue here. Come on, we've got to fight back. You've got to do something about this. It's not just you, Ruth. But she couldn't see it. So I suppose after Ruth's death, I mean, I was never in any doubt that I wanted to speak out.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, I did. It was when the Ofsted report finally came out. That's why I spoke out at that point. And it was, it was sort of largely motivated, I suppose, at that point by a sort of desire to clear my sister's name. That Ruth, I could just envisage the kind of story there might be. Head teacher kills herself after inadequate judgment. Oh, what was there? And it was just like, no, that isn't the story. That isn't the story here. And then, as soon as I spoke out, it was, this sort of massive reaction. Massive. I think it was Branwen Jeffries who sort of said something like, the dam has burst on strength of feeling or whatever. It felt like it was this, oh God, I sort of suspected it, but wow, that is this sort of pent up anxiety, the depth of it, the breadth of it was quite astounding, really.
And I remember when that report did come out, there was something, I can't remember specifically what was in it, but there was something where they had to change the wording in it or something, because it was very, very sort of blasé, wasn't it?
Well, there was a comment. They didn't have to. They shouldn't have changed it, actually. That's Ofsted sort of rewriting the story to make themselves look better, too late. Yeah, there was a bit in the kind of, information about the school between the breakfast. Caversham Primary provides a breakfast club and the after school whatever, there was something like, there's been a change of leadership at the school since the death of the previous head teacher, and go, nothing to do with you, Ofsted, at all. So that was sort of tasteless, to put it mildly, but a kind of a taste of things to come, really.
And this campaign that you then began, which really happened between March and December 2023, you did your first interview on BBC South Today, and then subsequently you've spoken at the NAHT conference. You've had how many hours of meetings with the DFE?
18
hours of meetings with the DFE. And you must have, I mean, when you say meetings with the DFE, have they been with the top people in the DFE?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think 11 of those hours were with Gillian Keegan, me sitting next to Gillian Keegan, but it was the sort of, the permanent secretary, the heads of, the regional director, the heads of,
So
it was all
how
sort
did you find those meetings? Because that must have been, I mean, did you come out of those meetings feeling like you were battling, or did you come out of those meetings feeling they're on our side, but they're not there yet?
Yeah. I went into, I remember the very first meeting, prepared. I was thinking, I'm not prepared to get talked out. No, I'm not going in there to just be sort of talked over and, talked out. So I went in there. I was originally offered half an hour, and I said, I'm not coming all the way to London to talk about something as important as this for half an hour. I want at least an hour. So they gave us an hour. It ended up being 3. I'd also asked to be accompanied by Lisa, the wonderful Lisa Telling, who's a local head teacher who knew Ruth, and by Edmund Barnett Ward, who's the parent at Caversham Primary, whose kids were at Caversham Primary the whole time Ruth was head teacher, and who knew her well. Because I thought it was important that you get the teacher's point of view as well as the parents' point of view, and not just the grieving family's point of view. And also Ruth's local MP came. I requested that they come to the meetings as well. So the first meeting, we had 3 hours. I was expecting an hour max.
And this was with Gillian. This was with Gillian Keegan.
Gillian Keegan was there, and I came out of that really, surprisingly positive in that I remember a couple of phrases that she said repeatedly. Something has clearly gone wrong here. Something's gone wrong here. I want to put it right. This can't be allowed to happen again. These are the things. I want to work with you. She kept in this, work with you to put things right. And so we did have 18 hours of meetings. I can't remember exactly how many meetings, did this once. How many?
Absolutely,
we had lots of meetings, not all of them with Gillian, but most of them with Gillian Keegan. And I felt that we were making progress. I thought that she got it. What
do you think that her hands, there'd be some who would say, well, Gillian Keegan's hands are tied because government policy is X and the way things have worked has always been X. Did you feel like she had the power to do anything in those meetings?
She said she didn't. I mean, what became increasingly frustrating. So the very first meeting I came out of, surprised and cautiously optimistic. Progress was made in those meetings. Things did change as a result of those meetings, but there were always these sticking points. Notably, 1 and 2 were judgments, which is sort of, government policy, not just DFE policy. There were also in those early meetings this kind of, well, the DFE is responsible for this, but Ofsted's sort of autonomous of us. And, if Amanda Spillman doesn't want to shift, I can't make her. And, this sort of playing them off. So during those meetings with the DFE, then it was kind of, well, we can't make Ofsted do this, but we can do this. And we will change these things. And then once Martin Oliver came into power, it's sort of become, well, I'm limited by what the DFE allows me to do because I work to the government of the day, and you go, right, what's true here? What's true? What is obviously true is that Ofsted and DFE do work very closely together, and if they both wanted to make really significant change, they could. It's in Martin Oliver's remit as the Chief Inspector to advise the Secretary of State on policy. It is also clearly in the DFE or the Parliament's remit to hold Ofsted accountable, to change the policies and the ways, the structures within which Ofsted inspects. So there's been a lot of this to-ing and fro-ing, which over the 18 hours plus meetings with then with Ofsted has become sort of increasingly frustrating, really.
Did you it was well documented and publicized at the time as well that Amanda Spielman, I think during your Woman's Hour interview, you even said that she hadn't offered. I think there was that thing, wasn't it, where she went on with Laura Kay on BBC, and she basically said something like, "Yeah, we've offered this, this, and this," or something.
No, what happened?
There was something there. You explained it to me. There was a.
What happened was after the interview with Laura Kuenssberg. So Laura Kuenssberg rather put Amanda Spielman on the spot, saying, because at this point Ofsted had publicly offered our family condolences. We're really sorry, we offer condolences or whatever. But none of our family was ever contacted directly by Ofsted with any condolence. So there's a sort of public message, but no contact. We had zero contact from Ofsted. And actually, quite early on, I had asked the local authority to arrange meetings with Ofsted. Wanted, and they never materialised. So we did, these sort of public pronouncements of sympathy and condolences, but actually no attempt to meet us at all, and no desire to hear from us what our concerns were about the inspection system. Laura Kuenssberg put that to Amanda Spielman on TV. According to Julia Waters, you've never contacted the family. And so after the interview with Laura Kuenssberg, Amanda Spielman wrote to Reading Borough Council, to the local authority, asking to be put in touch with Ruth Perry's next of kin, because she didn't have our contact details, and she understood we would like a meeting with her. And this was hot on the heels of the interview in which she had just defended the Caversham primary inspection result as sound, had said that it was conducted with professionalism and sensitivity. And I think you will understand why I thought there is no point in meeting someone who has done that whilst at the same time saying that she couldn't talk about the Caversham primary inspection ahead of the inquest. But she had just on national TV, using her public voice and her public platform, had tried to sort of prejudge what the results of the inquest might be by saying that there was nothing wrong with the Caversham primary inspection. So yes, whilst put on the spot on live TV, she had then offered to meet, and but there was no point at that. She clearly was not open to hearing our concerns, to hearing what Ruth had told us about the inspection. She'd already made up her mind what her view of that inspection was.
Yeah,
so that's the history of the offer of the meeting that came.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I don't want to spend too long on Amanda Spielman, but it is important to note that she has appeared on a lot of different media since the death of Ruth Perry. She's appeared on countless podcasts and sort of mainstream media to talk about it, and even recently, even 2 weeks ago, she went on a podcast, I think, called Difficult Women, where she said a number of things like it was really deeply difficult for me. She said that people assume everything should be about making the adults comfortable and happy and forget about the extra risk that puts on children. She said, I found people incredibly unwilling to discuss the fact you can't keep everyone happy and protect children. She said it was deeply unpleasant, the whole thing. I tried to communicate to people in private how Ofsted works, like other inspectorates, and she went on from that. I mean, just briefly, what is your reaction to that?
I was deeply disappointed that Amanda Spielman, who is no longer head of Ofsted, is still being given airtime, is still being given oxygen to share her completely discredited views. Essentially, when she said, didn't she say as well, there were no mistakes made in the Caversham inspection? What she's saying there is the senior coroner for Berkshire, after a very lengthy and a very, very thorough inquest, got it wrong. that prevention of future deaths report was wrong. What is being very obvious to me is that Amanda Spielman, when they apologized initially for the distress caused to Ruth by their inspection, not for causing Ruth's death because of the flaws in the inspection and the inspection system. Amanda Spielman was clearly very concerned about the reputational damage that Ruth's death was causing her. That's what she found distressing, not the fact that an Ofsted inspection has again been proven to be linked to someone's death. And, well, I'm afraid, whether Amanda Spielman likes it or not, her legacy is indelibly associated with my sister's death. And she can go on national media as often as she wants, trying to rewrite history, trying to claim that the inquest got it wrong. But her legacy is associated with Ruth's death.
Moving on from Amanda Spielman for a moment, let's just circle back to the coroner's hearing a bit and just talk me through, because that must have been an incredibly intense. I think it was 2 weeks it lasted.
It was, yeah. There were different stages to it. There was the opening. There were 2 pre-inquest reviews, and then the inquest itself. That was, it went over 2 weeks, but I think it was 7 days.
Did you feel at that point during that coroner's inquest that Ofsted were listening? Did you feel like that was, do you feel like, obviously we'll talk about Martin Oliver in a bit, right? He's come in as the new chief inspector fairly recently, right? But just going through the whole process from start to finish, do you think that Ofsted have been listening? Like, did you feel they were listening during the coroner's inquest?
No. At the end, where the conclusion, the coroner's conclusion, there was an audible intake of breath from the Ofsted seats. Throughout the inquest, and I would say this was at all levels, so from the individual inspectors to Christopher Russell, the Director for Education, who was called to give evidence, through the lawyers. There was a constant attempt to blame other people, the local authority, Ruth's colleagues, to try to extend the scope of the inquest to imply that there were actually really serious safeguarding concerns that were found, and that's what led to Ruth's death, not the way that the inspection was conducted, not the flawed framework and the consequences and so on. No, there was a noticeable refusal to reflect on their own practices, to consider what might have been done differently. And I mean, the coroner actually at the beginning of the inquest chastised the highest levels of Ofsted leadership for making some surprisingly insensitive comments just before the inquest, and that, about Ruth's death being used as a pivot to discredit the work of Ofsted and so on, which was Amanda Spielman's, on Woman's Hour just shortly before the inquest. So, no, there was no reflection, there was no contrition, there was no admission of fault at all. They were trying to blame the governors, they were trying to blame the local authority, they were trying to blame Ruth's colleagues, they were trying to blame Ruth, anything to deflect from what became absolutely blatantly obvious through the inquest where the fault actually lay.
There's been a movement, hasn't there, towards this whole since then. We've had Amanda Spielman leave her position and be replaced by Sir Martin Oliver as chief inspector. We've had a noticeable approach from a sort of very audible approach from Ofsted of calling it the big listen, where they're basically saying, we want to hear from the profession. And I know you've met Sir Martin Oliver a few times. You've mentioned that he has been a school leader, so he you feel like he sort of understands that side of it more than perhaps some predecessors have. But I wondered, even this week, it's just come out. I think on Thursday it's going to come out, the feedback, but it's already been leaked. It was in an article in Schools Week just yesterday that one phrase judgments are going to stay. So it was almost basically saying, I don't know whether this is true or not, but it's saying they're off the table. And I wondered what your reaction to that is. But also, let's talk a little bit as well about, you've met Sir Martin Oliver a few times, haven't you? So can you talk me through that and talk me through what your thinking is at the moment based on the information that's coming out?
I have met Martin Oliver. I've had 2 meetings with him, and I've met him on a couple of other occasions, and exchanged emails with him and some of his colleagues. My initial reaction to him was positive, for the reasons you say. He said the right things. He has the right kind of experience. He claimed that he's taken the job because he wants to make change and make Ofsted better. He seemed genuinely, upset and sympathetic about what had happened to Ruth. I must say, I'm not 100% convinced about the big listen, about the need for the big listen. The inquest came up with some pretty strong recommendations for what the things that need to change. The parliamentary inquiry, which we haven't mentioned yet, has also came up with some very strong evidence-based recommendations.
What did that recommend? Can you talk people through that just sort of briefly?
Recommendations on that? I think it's important to sort of, to point out, if people aren't aware, though I imagine many of your listeners will be aware, the Education Select Committee is a cross-party parliamentary committees, but it is made up, but there's a majority of Conservative MPs on it nonetheless. And they had a long and thorough parliamentary inquiry into Ofsted's work in schools, so looking particularly at that aspect of it, and heard from, had a big listen of their own, received, hundreds and hundreds of pieces of evidence, and heard from many people, individuals and representative bodies from of all the different parties affected by Ofsted and Ofsted inspections. And they came up with, their report, which recommended rethinking single word judgments as a priority was one of the key things. They'd heard, overwhelming evidence of the harm done by single word judgments, reconsidering how safeguarding is assessed, and whether it should be a separate separate annual check rather than part of the Ofsted inspection generally. There were things they said about reconsidering the idea that a school is academized automatically after 2, requires improvement judgments. They also said that an inadequate judgment for safeguarding should only be given for schools that are fundamentally failing to keep children safe. I mean, there were a whole series of what seemed to be very sensible recommendations that I would have hoped the DFE and Ofsted would take on board and act upon as a priority, as Robin Walker, the chair, had said. Whereas it seems to be now they're having a big listen to ask again about some of the those issues that were raised there and others.
Well, someone's commented here, Bear FCCT on Twitter says, I don't trust the big list and the questions were loaded. I responded in a hardline way and didn't play their game. He thinks it was a con. Do you think it's a con, the big listen?
I think it's unfortunate the way, the questions have been set up and the things. I mean, Sir Martin Oliver has said that nothing's off the table, but there are clearly some quite important issues that aren't explicitly on the table. I understand people's skepticism. I am concerned that it's delaying the implementation of really important changes. But I would encourage your listeners to engage with it, use it. And if you're not happy with the questions, then use the free text boxes to tell Ofsted the questions they should be asking and giving them the answers you want to give them, and finding a way around the structures that are there.
I wondered whether, because if we don't know this for sure, but let's say that government and Ofsted say one word judgments on changing that is off the table. It's not gonna. That's it. It's off the table. Would you change your position, which I know you said at the NEU conference the other week, that you, now I don't want to misquote you, so I'm going to paraphrase it. You tell me exactly what you said. But I think you said that the campaigning for the abolition of Ofsted as a core campaign of members of the NEU was unwise, wasn't the best way forward. Would you change your position on that if you felt that one word judgments were staying regardless of anything else that happened?
There's sort of different things in there, aren't there, to unpick. My reason for saying at the NEU conference that I didn't think campaigning to abolish Ofsted was the right approach was not because I don't understand the strength of feeling behind wanting that, or the reasons for that strength of feeling. I really, really, really do. My reasons were more sort of pragmatic ones. The Conservative government ain't going to get rid of Ofsted. The Labour government have, Bridget Phillipson has said that Labour wouldn't get rid of Ofsted. So if we know that that's not going to happen anytime soon, rather than continuing to campaign, I think the NEU has been campaigning to get rid of Ofsted since Ofsted was set up. How did that help my sister? How has campaigning to abolish Ofsted helped to prevent the Ofsted system becoming increasingly, it seems, punitive and hardline and harmful? It hasn't. So I think let's work with if Martin Oliver is claiming that he wants to change things, if he says he wants to listen, then speak, make your voices heard and push back, engage with that. I can see how, some people won't be convinced. Some people will think that, the image is too tarnished and do away with Ofsted. But I think there's a real danger of at least being seen in saying getting rid of Ofsted, to be seen to be saying that schools shouldn't be accountable, and that is never going to be something that the government anytime soon is going to agree to. So I think, a better approach, I'd have said, the different teaching unions and head teachers associations get together. I'm not going to say what an inspection system should look like. I'll have my opinions on it, but I'm not an schools inspection expert, and I never claim to be. But there are plenty of clever people out there who are school inspection experts, school improvement experts, I think the union should get together and decide amongst, it might be a range of, we can accept from here to here, but these are the things we can't accept. And as a collective voice, go to Ofsted and say, negotiate on that basis. These are the elements that are really harmful, dangerous, that are a risk. They're a risk of future deaths. There is a risk of future deaths if these things don't change. You must change these, and these, as this is a range of solutions that we would be happy with, having consulted with our membership, and to work in that kind of spirit rather than go abolish Ofsted. They're not going to do it, and it just allows positions to become more entrenched, I think.
So
you're saying getting rid of Ofsted, we're saying keep it as it is. No, there needs to be movement from both sides.
You're saying basically you want a coordinated union policy on it, really. You want something across all of them. Let's touch on a couple of other bits just towards the end now. Just a couple of other bits to sort of touch on finishing off. Christine Gilbert was appointed to lead the independent review. What were your thoughts on that? She is obviously she's a former head of Ofsted, a former chief inspector. What were your thoughts on that one? Well,
maybe give a little bit of background first for your listeners who might not know. The coroner at Ruth's inquest criticised both Ofsted, actually, and the Reading Borough Council for not having conducted any form of learning review after Ruth's death. What lessons what went wrong? What could they have done differently? What might be the features of our system that contributed, etc. So both Reading Borough Council and Ofsted then have committed to doing a learning review, both of them conducting an independent learning review. And in theory, yes, that makes sense to have an independent review at this stage rather than what might have been an internal one previously. I have no strong views one way or the other about Christine Gilbert herself. I've heard good things about her. She has plenty of relevant experience. But, the optics ain't great, are they? It's meant to be an independent review. And however rigorous a former head of Ofsted may be, I simply cannot see how that person can possibly be truly impartial and independent. There will be people working in Ofsted today who worked with Christine Gilbert in her time. There will be systems in place that were in place when she was there, or maybe she put in place when she was chief inspector. So what I fear is that however thorough, however probing the investigation, the review may be, it will at the very least be perceived as not being independent. And as in addition to the appointment of a former head of Ofsted to review Ofsted's response to my sister's death, I'm also concerned actually about the really limited terms of reference of that review. When the coroner criticised Ofsted for not having had any kind of review, what she clearly was indicating is that the kinds of things that the inquest went into, Ofsted should have gone into. They should have asked questions about, should have met the family probably and Ruth's colleagues and asked questions about what might have contributed, oh, look, there have been other suicides in the past. Did we learn from them? What, are there similar things in place? What would suicide prevention experts say about our framework and our systems that could be done differently? But no, Ofsted have interpreted this as look into Ofsted's response after Ruth's death in quite limited ways. What was the communication? What support was offered to staff? And so on. And when should we have a learning review, in future? So I'm concerned about the lack of independence of the independent reviewer. I'm concerned about the terms of reference. And also it would appear, I mean, they may correct me here, that the review will report to Ofsted. I'm very much hoping that that report will be made public and won't just be an internal independent review.
What do we do? What do you do? What are you going to do if nothing changes as a result of all of this?
You know, lots of people have asked me that. I mean, things have changed.
Yeah, there have been some changes. That was rather sort of bad of me to say that. There have been some changes, but I mean the sort of changes that you want to see.
Yeah, there need to be far more. There need to be far more fundamental changes. The changes that have come in so far, I've said, have been kind of half measures and lip service. They're things that are addressing the very specific circumstances that Ruth found herself in. And what I worry, and you know, they may not have, I have no way of knowing, sadly, whether they would have helped Ruth or not. No. What they certainly don't do is ensure that no other head teacher, whatever the circumstances, is given the right kind of support and structures and things in place after a bad Ofsted inspection. You know, there will be. I've never said, you know, schools do need to be held accountable, as Amanda Spielman has been saying constantly. You know, there are schools that are struggling, where there are issues that need to be addressed, and but it can never be acceptable that a head teacher feels suicidal as a result of that. You know, that there are ways to support people who may have been, you know, promoted above their abilities or have taken on a really challenging school or whatever. There's got to be ways of doing it that don't make dedicated people feel they have no choice but to end their own life. So what do I want? What I'm hoping,
what are you going to do?
What am I going to do? You know, I have been asked by various people in the DFE, you can imagine, I think in this kind of, so when are you going to be happy? When are your wins, Julia? Why didn't you take those wins? And I think that when people ask me that, and I know this isn't what you've asked me, Tom.
No.
They don't understand my motivation. You know, I have nothing personally or politically to gain from this. Nothing. I can't bring my sister back, you know. That's the only thing that would make a difference to me, to bring my sister back, and that is impossible. But I'm not driven by any sort of personal political ambition. I'm driven by love for my sister and by deep, deep, deep sadness at what happened to her, and by a really urgent need to do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if the DFE and Ofsted won't do it themselves, then I really hope that at least by speaking out, I have encouraged other teachers and head teachers to speak out, that they know they're not alone, that they know it's not them, it's this system, and that there is help, and that there are other people who have been made to feel the way they feel, and that they won't put up with it anymore. I hope that people will speak out, that people will complain, that teachers and head teachers will feel emboldened and galvanized enough to push back. And I'm hoping that the unions will support them in doing that. You know.
Yeah, no, that absolutely answers my question. my very last question of the whole interview was going to be around what would you say? And before I'll give you a minute actually to think about this answer before you answer it. But my question was going to be to you at the end was, what would you say to the teachers and leaders and people out there who are very pro Ofsted and also pro one word judgments, or certainly pro or the status quo? That they are pro the way things are now and they want it to stay the same. So I'm going to ask you in a minute what your sort of response would be to those who are still posting, reports on social media to say we've just got outstanding, or whatever the levers are that these people are doing. What you would say to maybe try and persuade them to your course of action in terms of the reform. But before we do that, it'd be a good time for me to just mention one last time our supporters and sponsors tonight, which is Teach Well Toolkit. If you're interested in finding out more, it's senior mental health training for anybody in your school. It's funded, it's fully funded, it's completely free. So your school doesn't need to pay for it. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about that, there is a QR code on the screen which takes you to a specific page where you can register interest in that training from Steve and Sunita. You could also visit teachwelltoolkit.com to find out more about it. So definitely check that out. It's senior mental health lead training. It's fully funded until 2025. So definitely check that out if you get the chance. So Julia, my final question was that. What would you say to the people who want things to stay the same?
I would say, clearly, prior to the November 2022 inspection of Caversham Primary was an outstanding school. The parents still considered it to be a wonderful school, still to this day consider it to be a wonderful school. Even though Ruth was the head of an outstanding school, she was the one who advised me that if you want to understand a school, you need to visit it. You need to understand it. You need to decide whether it's the right place for your child and your child's own interests and needs. And I would also say, education, children aren't best served by a sort of dog-eat-dog competitive education system. The best environments are ones that are collegial, that work together, that collaborate, that share best practice. And I would hope that teachers and head teachers understand that sticking their outstanding banner on the railings outside their school to sort of distinguish themselves from a school down the road doesn't build that kind of sense of community and shared values and collaboration that's really needed to provide the best kind of start in life for children. And you're only ever one bad Ofsted inspection away from a very different kind of outcome. So I would really encourage people not to argue that they shouldn't be accountable, not, as always, to strive always to do better and to improve and to offer the best standards. Of course, those are things that every head teacher should want, but you don't need a single word judgment to sum that up. Whether that's outstanding, inadequate, or the judgments in between, that word can never, ever sum up all the qualities of a school. So, think again. I think there could and really urgently should be a far more supportive, collaborate, compassionate kind of system that really encourages people to do better rather than punishing them for perceived failings and weaknesses.
Julia, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you tonight. It's been incredibly insightful. I know many people out there find you very inspirational in their daily work, as teachers and leaders. So from them, I say thank you very much, and from me, obviously, for spending this time with me
Could I say a big thank you back as well, please, to the teaching profession? As you can imagine, the last 16 months have been hellish. They've been horrible. We've been through the most appalling experience, and we've done it in public. And it has just been so heartening to get these sort of messages of support from the teachers out there. You're doing an amazing job in often very, very, very difficult circumstances, and I really appreciate it. Keep at it. And if you need help, get help. You're not alone. But thank you for supporting me and my family. It's meant a lot.
Yeah, I know there'll be a lot of teachers out there who would say the same thing back to you, because I'm sure they felt very supported by you in that sort of public way. In some ways, I know many have said that this is the first time they've seen somebody really sort of prominently go to bat for this in a very public way. You could argue that some people haven't had the chance to do that, but then equally, someone still has to do it. So I think there'll be a lot of people out there who would thank you for that, and who would take great sort of.
I've had lots of support from lots of brilliant people, and they know who they are if they're watching. So thank you. You know, for
sure.
You can't. No one can do it on their own.
Yeah. So listen, thank you very much, and take care. And maybe at some point somewhere down the line we'll speak to you again about the sort of where we're up to with it all.
See what happens on Thursday now. Hey,
Thursday will be the next thing. So thank you very much, and good evening to you.
Thank you.
That was Julia Waters, the sister of Ruth Perry. Big thanks to all of you for watching along, and especially to the people who've made comments. I know we haven't had a chance to read them out. Read all of them out, but there's been a number of people who've been watching along. So if you have been watching along, then thank you for joining us for this. What I feel has been an important conversation with Julia, which I'm sure we'll be following up again and again on Teachers Talk Radio, because this story isn't going to go away. It's something that is going to continue on with regards to Ofsted and potential reform of Ofsted. If you have views on this, then please tweet us at TT Radio Official, or maybe you could follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you use social media. You can get over there and share your views, share your thoughts, share your comments, and we will come back to them and share them again, potentially this Sunday on the weekly review. So with that in mind, I'm going to say good evening to you, and have a good rest of the week. I'll be back on Thursday actually with Bill Rogers, the behavior expert. So if you're up late enough, I'm going to be having a very late night because he's in Australia time. So I will be here at midnight for that. So if you happen to be one of those weird people that does a sort of a 1 a.m. bedtime and then a 5 a.m. get up every day for school, then you could join me for that. So yeah, that'll be available as well as a podcast, I'm sure, soon. So thank you very much, everybody, and speak to you again.